All right, guys, we are back in my garage for another video, and I honestly think this is the biggest news I've ever shared on this channel. Turn 14 was just hit by the EPA and fined for selling emissions delete devices. And a lot of you probably don't understand just how big a deal this is, but Turn 14 is basically the Amazon warehouse of the aftermarket parts industry. I don't care if you're ordering from HondaBoy.com or SuperFastMustangs.net. I guarantee you they are shipping parts through Turn 14 distribution, and they are basically the biggest aftermarket parts distributor in the United States. So the fact that they just got hit by the EPA is a huge deal, and it's the biggest fine I've ever seen. If you guys thought that Cobb getting fined $2.9 million was a big deal, this completely knocks that out of the water. It's over $3 million. So in this video, I want to try to give you guys the timeline of exactly what's going on, how we got to this point, and what we can expect in the future so that you have an idea of how things might be changing in 2025. So let's go ahead and jump into it. Now, as always, for everybody that's new to the channel, I create these videos to help keep you updated on the latest developments in our community, as well as discuss technical topics so that we have a better understanding of how our engines work. So if you're interested in more videos like that, be sure to subscribe because there will be a lot more coming out in the future. Now, I will have chapters down below, so if you guys want to skip around, if you don't need too much of the background information, feel free to skip forward. But I want to try to tell the whole story so that we're all on the same page of exactly what happened and what Turn 14 is responsible for. So I'm going to be looking at my notes from time to time just to make sure I get all the details. It's a lot of information, but I want to make sure I get it right. I won't have, too much of my own personal bias or opinions in here. I'm just going to give you the straight facts. So let's go ahead and do this. So this all started with the EPA. And for those that don't know, the EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency, and they're responsible for regulating anything that could have a negative impact on the environment. A lot of it deals with companies and how they dispose of waste and things like that. But it also deals primarily, like what we're talking about in this video, how cars are managing their emissions. So they set the laws on how OEMs need to implement engines and how emissions controls should be put on, as well as what owners of vehicles are allowed to do to their emission system, which, surprise, is basically nothing. They have a law called the Clean Air Act, which basically defines that nothing on a motor vehicle can be modified in the emission system unless it is only being used for racing purposes. So if you ever go to buy aftermarket parts and you see, in the fine print, it says only for off-road use, that's basically what they're trying to do, is stipulate that this meets the requirements for the Clean Air Act because it's only designed for race cars or cars that are being used for racing. Otherwise, if you're on the street, you need to meet all of the emissions requirements for any car that you use for daily driving. Now, this has always been a concern for people that like to modify their cars and, of course, people that sell aftermarket parts. And what we saw was the change of some wording in the Clean Air Act. And the way that it was interpreted is that it removed that exception for race cars. So now you basically were not allowed to modify any street car that was sold with a VIN and intended for road use, even if you were modifying it to turn it into a race car. The only thing that you could use are cars that came without VINs. So like kit cars or cup cars, dedicated race cars built by manufacturing companies that only do that. So this is a huge issue, especially people like me that like to modify and race cars. The most accessible way to do it is to buy a car that was made for street use and modify it. It's really hard to buy a dedicated race car if you don't have places to store it. And just in general, it's a much more expensive process to get into that. And it's going to reduce how many parts aftermarket companies could sell because there's going to be a lot less vehicles that qualify for this exclusion. So both owners and enthusiasts were upset, as well as aftermarket parts companies. And this all really came to a head when the RESC, which stands for Racing Enthusiasts and Supplier Coalition, decided to really take the legal route and attack this head on. So they put together a petition and brought this to the courts. Now, in their complaint, they highlighted 9 different areas that they were concerned with, and they kind of grouped it into 3 different categories. And the first one was the definition of a motor vehicle. Basically categorized any car that was designed to be driven on the road as a motor vehicle, and that was the concern, that it removed the exception for race cars. They also tried to address the stipulation where people were saying this isn't meant to, change the laws for race cars, but they felt like it indirectly did by how the wording was changed. So it needed to be updated in order to prevent people from, incorrectly being accused of breaking the law. But then I was really surprised to see that after their entire complaint, they took it a step further and noted that Turn 14 and companies like it could sue the EPA for damages, because based on how this wording was changed, it would make a lot of their work illegal, which would hurt their business, cause them a loss of business, and indirectly allow them to sue the EPA for damages. And then it went even further, and the CEO of Turn 14 himself had a message after the complaint and how they felt like after this new wording, they would be negatively impacted and they would sue the EPA for damages. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I feel like that's probably pretty aggressive. If you're going to tell the EPA that you're liable for millions of dollars for making a change to how you're managing emissions in the United States, they're probably not going to take that lightly. And surprisingly enough, they didn't. The whole entire petition was thrown out and it was not taken well at all. You can see in the report by the judge that they basically called the RESC incompetent, which is disappointing to see, but you can see it literally states multiple times that the RESC lacks understanding of what the RPM Act is and how the Clean Air Act was written, but it pulled back everything that the RESC was concerned with and said that none of that changed. The definition of motor vehicle was the same, the exceptions for race cars was the same. All they did was update the wording to further support what was already being made legal. So they didn't change any of the laws and none of this was a valid concern. Then it goes into further say that Turn 14 is a part of the problem. Instead of trying to understand what the RPM Act was specifying, they escalated the issue, caused this huge fuss online with these petitions and things, and jumped into action that was a waste of time, when in reality, they don't know what Turn 14 sells. They don't know if they're selling emissions delete devices. Maybe they are a part of the problem and need to be investigated. And then, as you probably are guessing, they were investigated. So here's the complaint that the EPA filed against Turn 14. And you can see it basically says that they're violating the Clean Air Act related to its sale and offering for sale of aftermarket products that bypass, defeat, or render inoperative emissions controls. And this qualifies for a lot more things than we probably realize. Most people think it's just, deleting your catalytic converter, but even things like intakes, fuel upgrades that modify your evap system, even just a tune, anything that puts your car in a state that wasn't originally qualified by the EPA to be approved for road use, is effectively deleting emissions controlled systems that put your car outside of what the EPA is approving for legal use. So you might even see some tuners, like especially in the BMW world, there's Dynan and JB4 that are approved by the EPA. They went through all the extra steps of testing and getting that qualified, so they got the stamp of approval that it's legal to use. But most companies don't go through that process because it's expensive and it also limits the performance or the effectiveness of their products. You won't be able to make as much power and it won't run as efficiently with those emissions controlled devices, so it's easier just to work around them to get the most performance possible. Now, the complaint goes even further and says not only is Turn 14 selling these devices, but they know they're selling them to people that aren't driving race cars, and they're not doing anything to stop that. So again, remember the Clean Air Act has a provision for race cars. These are cars that you are not going to drive on the street. You're only going to use it for drag racing, road racing, off-road, whatever that is. So if it's a car that you have for dual purpose, technically you can only have that installed at the racing event. And if you plan on driving it to work or to the grocery store, it needs to be reverted back to stock. And they're basically saying that Turn 14 might put that little fine print and stuff on the products that they're selling to say it's only for off-road use, but they know they're selling it to people that drive it on the street, and they're not doing enough about it. Even though they have that awareness, they should be doing more to make sure it doesn't happen. Now, the complaint goes into a lot of detail because line by line, you can see them listing over 500, actually almost 600 defeat devices that are in the inventory that Turn 14 sells. So they're not just saying this is a problem, they're saying this is a huge problem. And like I said, Turn 14 is basically the biggest distributor in the United States. So this is going to be a long list of parts that they sell. Then they went to their books and checked and confirmed that between 2016 and 2021, there were over 140,000 products sold and distributed by turn 14. So that means that they had 140,000 offenses, basically discrete sales that they sold of these products over those 5 years, and each one would qualify for a fine of up to $5,911. Now I did the math just because I was curious, and that is $827 million that they could be fined for this. Insane. Now, side note, I did think it was interesting to see that Turn 14 had been investigated as early as 2018. It looks like the EPA stopped by there 7 years ago to start investigating and seeing what was going on. And then they started asking them for more information on what they were selling. And year after year, Turn 14 was sending the EPA updates based on their questions. And year after year, these updates basically confirmed they were still selling emissions delete devices. So at that point in 2020, Turn 14 officially sent them a notice saying that they identified this as a problem. And then we got to today where it was raised to an official complaint. So the settlement closed out last month, and a lot of you probably received an email, especially if you're a company that sells parts through Turn 14. They sent out this email saying that as a part of the settlement, they had to send you a notice, but there's a lot more in it. First, they got fined $3.6 million. Which is insane. That's almost $1 million more than what Cobb was fined. I think, again, just because of the size of the company and how many instances they had recorded of selling emissions delete devices, that kind of warranted this super high cost. So $3.6 million is the number, a lot lower than over 800 million, but still a significant hit. But there are also other stipulations in the settlement as well. So they are not allowed to sell any more emissions delete devices. They have to destroy any emissions defeat devices that they have in their existing inventory. They have to terminate all technical support for emissions delete devices that they've sold in the past. So they can't tell you how to install it. They can't tell you how to use it, remove it, anything like that. They also have to remove equipment from their fleet vehicles, which I thought was kind of interesting. I guess just reading into this, I'm assuming that means that maybe they have show cars and marketing cars that they use for car shows, and they have to return those back to stock. Maybe they have diesel trucks and stuff they use to tow around, or even maybe just their personal vehicle that they have under their business. They have to return them all back to stock and remove anything that deletes or modifies emissions on those cars. They also need to deny any future warranty claims on products that were previously sold. So if you have anything on your car, exhaust, intake, tune, anything like that, if you bought it and it had a 90-day warranty or year warranty or whatever, that is officially canceled if it was through Turn 14. They also need to update their marketing materials to remove any references to emissions delete devices so they can't insinuate that they still sell it. And then I think the icing on the cake is they need to train their employees and post and maintain written notices that document the Clean Air Act in their office. If you're like me, you might have different safety standards or ethics rules written up on the wall. Well, they're going to have the Clean Air Act posted around the office just to reinforce to their employees the importance of this. So yeah, there's a whole lot happening, and it seems like from the date of the settlement, which looks like it was January 16th, they had 30 days to comply. So I assume that's why now we're, 27 or 28 days out from that, and they're starting to send out these notices and do what they need to comply with this ruling. And I guess at this point, they've probably sent the $3.6 million, or at least worked out a process for how that's going to be paid out to the government. But huge hit. I mean, it really sucks for the company, of course, but also for the aftermarket parts industry. Again, every company that you buy from, I guarantee you, ships something through Turn 14, especially if they're selling turbos or things like that that are just universal products. They drop ship so many parts, especially with these new tariffs and stuff that are being put in place as well. I think overall things are going to get a lot more difficult to find and a lot more expensive to buy. So we'll kind of have to see as the year goes on how things change, but I definitely feel like this is the biggest hit to our aftermarket parts industry. Let me know what you guys think. If you've heard anything different, or if you've worked directly with Turn 14, what was your experience like? What do you think this is going to mean for the future? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts as well. But yeah, I think that's it for this video. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helps. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below.